Hello, and welcome now as we come to what is generally described as the ordinary or regular time of the year. There's nothing really ordinary about life. Each day is very special, but it is from now until really, with a few exceptions, till November, that we will be listening as our gospel guide to Matthew. This, as you remember, in a setup which we call the A, B, and C year. This is the A year, the year in which our attention is directed to the Lord through the writings of the Gospel Matthew. We pick up this week the 11th Sunday, where in a certain way we have left off prior to the beginning of the Lenten Easter time. So the readings to begin with, first of all, first comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 19, verses 2 through 6a. We now, in the second reading, will be listening to sections from Paul's great letter, perhaps his longest and some consider most influential of letters, namely the letter of Paul to the Romans, and this time we're in chapter 5, verses 6 through 11. And finally, Matthew's Gospel then, chapter 9, verses 36 through chapter 10, verses 8. So let us begin there. Keep in mind that Matthew's Gospel basically functions around 5 great homilies or sermons that Jesus is pictured as giving. Many who study the Matthew Gospel point out that if there is a model that this writer uses, it is to picture Jesus as the new Moses. And so many of the things that are connected with the story and life of Moses are a kind of background for the material that is used in Matthew's Gospel. So, if indeed there are 5 great works which are attributed, they are known as the books of Moses, or we call it the Pentateuch. Well, then in this gospel there are 5 great talks or sermons which Jesus gives. And the first of these is the most perhaps renowned and famous and longest, known as the Sermon on the Mount, which had begun with what we call the Beatitudes or the happy sayings. And interspersed between these 5 great sermons are activities of Jesus, actions of Jesus. And so that's where we pick up this time. Chapter 9, the end of that, close to the... Now, before this, Jesus has done some actions, but what we are given this time is a reflection on the action of Jesus and the importance of that. Now, in this episode, and remember we're hearing just a little bit of a section, I keep often reminding us that the continuity of the work is important, and in fact in this time, we hear a little section of the gospel where what is described and what is known as the mission discourse. In other words, having given his talk and having given some examples of how his ministry and action works out, he now chooses disciples to carry out his mission. Now, some have pointed out in looking at the structure of how these little groups work, that there were in Jesus' time, and this would be not simply something that would be characteristic of his movement, but of also movement of other philosophers or teachers. And often, by the way, keep in mind that teachers in those days were known for being on the move. They did not sit in one place where students came to them. That would be more a Johannine perspective. But Matthew represents the synoptic tradition pictures the disciples as moving, as bringing to others the message and the meaning of the teaching of Jesus. Now, there were a group known as a coalition, which was a group who gathered for a specific purpose over a limited time with no intention of being permanent once the directed goals had been achieved. So joining this kind of group did not mean that one had to quit other basic groups. So you could be, for example, part of a fishing community. Keep in mind that some of the early disciples, Simon and Andrew, were part of a fishing family. John and James were Zebedee's family, were part of a fishing family. So in that regard, they could be part of this group without abandoning the other group to which they were part. So a coalition meant that one would be a part of different groups. However, this could also give way to what we would know and what those who study these things call a faction, namely a characteristic of a coalition that is centered around a charismatic person who gathers followers and maintains loyalty in this core group. And that's where we now picture Jesus as now factions sometimes we think of as divisive, different factions, but in this case the coalition now will take on a more permanent identity, a more permanent mission. So in this gospel, Matthew, Jesus had limited goals, but now they become part of his faction. Now, why do I mention all of this? Because in gathering together disciples, and up to this point those who accept Jesus are called disciples, he now gathers a unique group, 12, who will be called apostles. The word apostle means one who is sent. And therefore he calls together 12, and it is in this gospel very much that the sense of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible is kept in mind, that 12 represented something that in Israel's past, most of the hearers of this gospel would be familiar with, a confederation of 12 tribes that descended from Jacob and his two wives, Leah and Rachel, and also their kind of concubines, Ziphrah and Bilhah. Now I give you all of this because the gospel writer who heard Matthew's gospel would be aware of this. So these together formed 12 sons who become known as the 12 tribes of Israel. The sons were, and you remember, Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, who had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, Benjamin, Gad, Asher, Dan, and Naphtali. Now, all of those, of course, you will not hear, but that would be the background of the 12 that is representative here. 12, of course, was symbolic, therefore, representing that if these were the founders of the great tribes of Israel, Jesus is now, by choosing 12 men, creating a new Israel. And keep in mind that that is an important theme running throughout the first gospel, that Jesus, as the new Moses, does not do away with the old, but brings it to a new level, to a deeper dimension. And so, when choosing these 12, they will be commissioned to gather the scattered sheep of Israel. Now, this may be a little bit interesting. When they are sent out, and who are these? Well, it is Matthew who pairs the 12. Now, the names appear in the other two synoptics, Mark and Luke, but it is really Matthew who kind of organizes them. So he names them in pair. Peter, who of course always appears first on these lists, and his brother Andrew. So it's Peter and Andrew. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew, who is named as a tax collector. James, the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus. Simon the Canaan, and Judas Iscariot, the one who would betray him. There's much discussion about the last attributed title to Judas Iscariot. Was he a man from Cariot, which would be a town or a place? So rather than that being his last name, it was an identity of place, where, of course, this would be popular, Jesus of Nazareth, where he came from, where others came from. So the 12, therefore, are set out, 6 pairs, to bring to the wandering house of Israel the message that Jesus is teaching. Now, it is interesting that the kind of commission given to these 12 is to go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of Samaritans, but only to seek out the lost sheep of Israel. So that might be a little interesting at this point, that the mission of the 12 is limited to fellow Israelites and to bring the message there. Their message is, the kingdom of heaven has come near. Enter now this community, accept this message. Now, it's important perhaps to notice, and I'm going to mention that part of this message of the commissioning, that is the sending out of the disciples, ends with the section that we listened to this time, namely verse 8 of chapter 10. But in chapter 10, there are a number of other commissions that are given, namely verses 8 to 25, which are not included in our reading because that part will be brought to our attention when we listen to the Gospel of Mark. So we're not, but I want to just kind of flesh out this whole mission-sending experience this time. In the Middle East, during the world, there was never and still is no such thing as a free gift. In other words, every gift has some strings attached to it. Everyone expects some repayment. And that is what becomes different in the message and the mission that Jesus gives to the 12, that they are not to expect any return for the gift that they bring. They are to rely exclusively on hospitality. And if the gift that they bring is rejected, if the group that they bring it to don't want to hear it, they are not to argue about it, but are simply to move on. And evangelizing means that the mission is to be fluid and to keep going. All right. So it really, interestingly, verse 8 is where our reading ends this time. They are called, that is, the 12, to do 4 things. And we will hear this in the final verse, verse 8. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. So they are to do, literally, what Jesus did, namely to announce that the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. So what Jesus did in chapters 8 and 9, which, as I say, precedes this, are to establish a continuity between what Jesus and his closest disciples are now doing. So all of that kind of fleshes out the mission that is given to the 12 at this particular moment. Now, let me just finish out a little bit here. The basic message, we're not going to do every verse, that runs from verse 8 to 25, because next time we will pick up at verse 26. So let's kind of look at here what is still part of this mission task. They are to live a simple lifestyle. Therefore, they are to take with them no gold, silver, copper, sandals, or staff. So they are simply to travel, if you want, lightly, all right, to really only depend on the hospitality that they might receive in the places where they go. Now, I do need to pause a moment here to remind us that the Galilee in which Jesus does his mission and in which the 12 live has a number of small villages and maybe even towns, but they're not that far apart, okay? Do not think that they go great miles when they move from village to village. So in the upper region of the Palestine, in the Galilee region, there were a number of small villages and towns. And so when they move from day to day, in fact, the message is when you are coming to a place and you receive hospitality, stay in the place maybe one night, possibly 2 nights, and not more than 3. Because if you stay for more than 3, then in fact you're out of it's out of the ball game. So I know all of those are kind of little background things that are part of the understanding of those who hear this gospel, and that I just mentioned because we have the opportunity here. So when they move on, now they either are accepted or rejected. And if the community wants nothing to do with the message, you remember the phrase, we've seen this before because it does appear in other places, shake the dust off your feet and move on, because they thought that somehow the community or even the gods were connected with the soil of the place. So leave it behind and move on. And there is a little bit of a threat here that Matthew includes, that what had happened to Sodom, and then he adds Gomorrah, namely their rejection, well, you know what happened to them. So just be a little careful, all right? So they represent, therefore, the disciples of the tradition of traveling missionaries. And also keep in mind that this gospel written sometime after the year 70, because in the year 70 of the common time, this would have been 40 years after Jesus' time, the city of Jerusalem had fallen, and Christian Judaism seemed to have been the best way of carrying on the Jewish tradition. The aim, therefore, keep in mind, was not to convert others to Christianity, but to renew and revive Judaism. And that the Christian Jews were arguing that we are, and this is the best way to continue the great promises that God had made to Israel, and hopefully that they would embrace. If they reject this message, then the idea simply is leave their fate to God. God will take care of things. Now, in verses 16 to 25, also included in those which are being left out, Jesus promises suffering during their mission and explains that this is necessary necessarily connected with following his ways. Now, there were two serious persecution situations that we believe arose during the time between Jesus and the writing of this gospel. They may not have been relevant to our time today, and that's important to notice that Matthew reflects concerns that were part of his community's experience. Two things that needed to be kept in mind. That one, they would suffer persecution from outsiders. There would be those who, and this could be from Jews also, who did not like what they were saying and made life difficult for those who proclaimed this message, and also led to divisions within the family. And you can see this was a real reality that happened. Some accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Others in the same family who had grown up in Judaism, remember they all were believers in the way of God through Judaism, rejected this. And so you can imagine how family divisions caused real concern and real harm. Even today, I suppose, if someone in the family accepts religion or beliefs in a tradition other than the one in which they were raised. So there is, in that sense, and again, all of this is left out, but it's part of the message that Jesus in Matthew is pictured as giving his disciples. There's lots of talk about suffering. And suffering had been, and I have to smile a little bit, but remember, it was part of the story of Israel. Israel had been oppressed before the Exodus by the Egyptians in their land and made to work and to suffer. That they had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and that they experienced suffering. That there had been a crisis that had led in Jewish life once they were in the Promised Land that led to the establishment of the monarchy, namely the great kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. That there had been suffering when the first temple, the temple built by Solomon, had been destroyed in the year 587 before the common time. That there had been suffering during the Maccabean time, which had happened in the middle of the 2nd century. And so suffering was a part of the experience, and therefore the disciples should also expect this. And then later on, when we read the writings of Paul, keep in mind that he often says that for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the message, I have had to suffer all kinds of difficulties. And in fact, in one place, he gives a long list of all the things that he had to undergo for the sake of the gospel. So the mission is not without tension. And the disciples should be aware of that and expect that as fellow Israelites, as fellow Hebrews. So all of this is the gospel for this time. The disciples are chosen. The apostles are named. They are to bring the message of Jesus to Israel, who are, and he uses a phrase that is also used in other places, like sheep without a shepherd. And in other places, Jesus, of course, picks up on the fact of being a shepherd, leading the sheep, gathering the sheep, informing the sheep, protecting the sheep. Again, an image that is popular in Israel's history, but also popular in New Testament thinking. Certainly we know famous stories about the lost sheep. So all of that is important because the message of Matthew here is the kingdom of heaven has come near. We've mentioned also before, by the way, that in this gospel, the reference is always to the kingdom of heaven. The other gospels will call it the kingdom of God, but Matthew, sensitive that the term or title for God should not be used, has changed it to the kingdom of heaven. But in our thinking, kingdom of heaven is the kingdom of God. So that's the gospel message for this time. The first reading comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 19. And this is interesting because Moses is leading the Israelites now in front of the mountain. We smile a little bit. We don't know what mountain this is. In the tradition, there are two mountains which are sometimes known as, because this is the mountain that Moses goes up and receives the covenant and the commandments. One of them is known as Jebel Musa, Jebel, capital M-U-S-A. This would be a mountain that's 7,500 feet high. And since the 4th century of the Common Time, this has been identified as Mount Sinai, namely the mountain in which, as I say, the covenant is given. However, we're never always sure that we have the right one. In the book of Exodus, same book we mentioned, in chapter 17, verses 1 through 17, and in the book of Numbers, chapter 20, verses 2 through 13, you can check this out, suggests that the mountain was near an area known as Kadesh, which is about 60 miles due south of Gaza, that strip you remember, which is on the Mediterranean Sea. And so some say that there is a mountain here called Jebel Heldal, Hedal, which is only 3,000 feet tall, and that's 25 miles from the place that we have mentioned. So, where is the hill? I just pause here because we have a moment to mention it. It is here that Moses receives from God the call and appoints him as messenger to the people. So you get the connection. If Moses is chosen as a messenger, Jesus has chosen the 12 to be his messengers. And Moses will present the message of God to Israel, citing 3 events. One, God's defeated the Egyptians, who delivered them from bondage. Secondly, God's guidance and protection as the Israelites move through the wandering years, and that they have arrived at this mountain which is divine presence. So all of these images are connected with Moses, and again, that really is I think the choice of the reading this time is Moses as the messenger. They will receive, because of the message that Moses gives, they will become a special people among all the other people. And notice, therefore, the connection, Israel, Jewish community. They will be a kingdom of priests, says Moses, and they will be a holy nation, holy in the culture, in the cultic sense, by the way, not in the moral sense. So not saying that Israel will be morally perfect, but they truly will be, by God's design, by the message that Moses gives, a people set apart. And there is, by the way, interestingly, just as we come to the end here, was an ancient rabbinical tradition, that recounts how 2 other nations had been offered by God to become the chosen people, and that they had declined. So there was a certain way, and notice how 3 often kind of fits into the pattern of things, that Israel was the 3rd choice on the part of God to be his special people. Now that's a rabbinic tradition, and I'm sure they kind of smile a little bit to say, well, we weren't your first choice, so that when we chose us and we accepted, you had to expect some of the limitations that we have. Well, all of that may be part of the lore that lies behind this imagery this time. Being chosen to be messengers of God and of Jesus as the gospel does. And I suspect that that is why it is presented this week for the consideration of the community that gathers to pray. For the kingdom of heaven is near, and each one who hears these words are also called, like the apostles of old, to be messengers of the kingdom. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.